Amen. Thank you, sir. All right. This is the first lesson in Church History 2. As I mentioned last week, originally there were 7 segments, 13 lessons each, based around Philip Schaff's work, and also the fact that we were alternating every 13 weeks. So I will say that in many cases, the first lesson of each session has review, and we're going to have a little bit of review in this. But this is Church History 2, and it is an introduction to the ante-Nicene age. And so as review, I just want to remind you the unique relationship that Christianity has with history. Because history is really that canvas that God is writing salvation on. And unlike any other religion, our most cherished doctrines are at the same time historical events, right? The virgin birth, the crucifixion, the resurrection. It's all based in history. As I was saying, I said at the men's breakfast yesterday, the real sin of liberal Christianity is to take Christ out of history and just make him your boyfriend, your inspirational figure, when really it's what he did in history. Okay. So just as nature is a revelation of God in space, history is really a revelation of God in time. In and of themselves, they're not saving revelations, but for Christians, they do allow us to see God's decree as it's unveiled, and we get a glimpse of his character in that. In particular, the history of the church has borne out those faithful promises of Christ. He told us, the world's going to hate you because they hated him. That's a very true statement. The apostles told us that false teachers were going to afflict us. They certainly do that. But Christ also promised he's never going to forsake us, and he's never done that, and that his church is going to remain until his return. And so that's why Philip Schaff said, he said that next to the Holy Scriptures, which are themselves a history and depository of divine revelation, there is no stronger proof of the continual presence of Christ with his people, no more thorough indication of Christianity, no richer source of spiritual wisdom and experience, no deeper incentive to virtue and piety than the history of Christ's kingdom. So when we look upon that heritage and those who lived the faith before us, we're really following a biblical pattern. Because God did not give us a systematic theology. He chose to couch his revelation in the history of his people. And so the writer of the book of Hebrews, remember, wanted his readers to understand that principle. And so in his 11th chapter, he talks about our legacy. Remember, he says, others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trials of mocking and scourging, of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, and they were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. Well, the next chapter, he then lays the charge at his readers' feet. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Jake actually talked yesterday at the men's breakfast about Abraham being able to look back at all the faithfulness of God. And that's what the book of Hebrews is telling us here. That's right. And so a great incentive to virtue and piety is that we consider that great cloud of witnesses that's gone on before us. And we come to know that great cloud of witnesses through church history in one way. And so in the next 13 lessons, we're going to get to know that cloud of witnesses that lived the faith immediately after the apostles. And if there was ever an age that mirrored the verses that we just read, it is this time period. When Hebrews 11 speaks of tortures and chains and being sawn in two, that's always been the lot of the church, even to this very day around the world. But it was especially true of the church of that day, because this was the age of the ecclesia pressa, the church that is oppressed. This is the classic age of persecution. For the entire period of this age, the practice of Christianity was against Roman law. The Romans classified it as a religio illicita. I I used to say illicit. Go back to my high school Latin. They didn't use S's and C's. But anyway, it's an illicit or illegal religion. And so when a Roman judge would pronounce the death penalty upon Christians, Rome was declaring you have no legal right to exist. So law enforcement and genocide were one and the same. And before this age was over, the greatest empire in Western history would put all of her resources behind the destruction of the race of Christians. But in the end, it was the pagan state that lay dying. And in the most remarkable and unique transformation in history, the mighty Roman Empire basically conquered by the testimony of Galilean fishermen and by the blood of those who believed that testimony. Rome literally exhausted herself in trying to destroy what Christ promised was indestructible. All right, so in framing our time period, I mean, you have to have a timeline in history, right? So the apostolic age ended with the death of the Apostle John somewhere around AD 96. At the other end of the age is the triumph of Christianity over Rome, which we're going to mark by the church's change in legal status in the year 312. In that year, Rome essentially sued for peace. We can't do this any longer. And so she issued an edict of toleration that recognized Christianity as a legal religion for the first time. Not long after the surrender was complete, you have a Christian emperor who convenes the first ecumenical council in church history in the city of Nicaea. What took place in Nicaea was so important that it forever secured that name into the age that's going to follow, the Nicene age. So now we have a timeline. On the one side, we have the Apostolic Fathers. On the other side is the Nicene age. And of course, now in between is what we call the Ante-Nicene age. That is the age before Nicaea. So it's not A-N-T-I, it's A-N-T-E, which means before. Just like an antebellum home is a house that was built before the war. So this is the church before Nicaea. So that's one designation we can use for this time period, although it's not very descriptive, because the apostolic age being defined by the Acts of the Apostles, the Nicene age being subject to the Nicene Creed, but the term ante-Nicene doesn't say much about that age in between. So a more descriptive term for this time period is the patristic age. This is where, obviously you can see it, it's paternal. Patristic means father. So, when you conduct a paternity test, you're investigating biological fatherhood. Well, here we're studying the patristic age, and we are studying then the ecclesiastical fatherhood of the early church, the age of the church fathers. Now, the first question we probably should ask about patristics, the study of these church fathers, what qualifies them to be church fathers? And the answer is they share two attributes. The first is orthodoxy. All the word orthodox means is correct belief. Although the standards for orthodoxy were less defined than they would later be, all the church fathers are considered orthodox, actually by definition. A heretical church father is a contradiction in terms. If your theological paternity points back to a heretic, you're not in the family tree of God. The second attribute is that they share antiquity. They are the closest to the age of the apostles. They were responsible for preserving the teachings of the church in that critical period before the writings of the apostles are accumulated together in what we know as the New Testament. So like any good parent, our church fathers taught their spiritual children the difference between nourishment and poison, between orthodoxy and heresy. So we've defined the age in question. It's the 200 years between 100 AD, 312 AD. So that's the age of the church fathers prior to the council at Nicaea. And I'd like to begin with a general overview when we begin a study of the patristic age, the natural inclination is to compare it back to the age of the apostles. And that comparison shows us two things, at least. That the faith once delivered to the saints has been preserved and continued. And second, that the age of the apostles is different. It's nothing less than the afterglow of Christ's earthly ministry. There's an unmistakable difference between the writings of the apostles and those of the church fathers. And the difference is so profound, it really defies natural explanation. It is only the divine inspiration of the apostles that can really adequately account for the contrast between the two ages. And so Schaff describes it this way. He says, the hand of God has drawn a bold line of demarcation between the inspirations of the apostles and the productions of enlightened but fallible teachers, to impress us the more deeply with the supernatural origin of Christianity and the incomparable value of the New Testament. And so a comparison between the writings of the New Testament and those of the church fathers, it only increases our appreciation of that unique work that God breathed into the apostles. Now, there's no question that the church fathers were remarkable men. A number of them had been disciples of the apostles themselves, but the days of direct revelation had passed with the death of John. That's the testimony of history. And really, how could it have been otherwise? And then it would have destroyed the authority of the New Testament. Now, in defense of the church fathers, we must remember the church is still in her infancy. The church fathers represent very shaky first steps. It would not have been easy to be the first generations, remember, to exegete and, look at the apostolic revelation and pull that and somehow give you this systematic theology. You shouldn't expect that to happen, and it doesn't happen. So the great figures that we find in these years are struggling to define where there's no definition already there. They're struggling to interpret where there's no precedence being laid. And they're struggling to preserve an orthodoxy that hadn't even been formalized yet. So there were unique difficulties facing this generation. And if you combine that with the pressures then of heresies and persecutions, the church fathers did a remarkable job. You and I can be thankful that we've had nearly 2,000 years of precedents to go back and examine, if we would choose to do that, which we should, but we often don't. But the church fathers didn't have that luxury. And while that led to some simplistic, even erroneous theology, they do deserve the appreciation of a grateful church. Okay, the critical aspects of the patristic age are fivefold. You have the continuous link to the apostles, you have the literary defense of the faith, you have the perseverance of the church through persecution, you have its confrontation with heresy, and then the development of Catholic, little c, doctrine, Catholic, big C, ecclesiology or church structure. We'll explain all that as we go. A critical part of the preservation of the church then was this link that existed between the apostles and the earliest church fathers. There is a traceable continuity, including a number of key figures that had personal contact with the apostles themselves. This was especially true concerning the apostle John. For example, John taught Polycarp, Polycarp taught Irenaeus, Irenaeus taught Hippolytus. Now, that's an apostolic succession of teaching, and that's an important distinction to make, because that term has been perverted by Roman Catholicism. Actually, apostolic succession is what eventually defeated Gnosticism. It's the pedigree, okay? It's not laying on of hands and now this continuation, you're now an apostle, you have an apostolic office. In fact, the true legacy of the apostles is Scripture, okay? However, that pedigree is incredibly important in defeating Gnosticism. We'll look at that. But these heretical groups, these Gnostics, they're claiming we have these secret doctrines that you guys don't know anything about, right? It's Copeland standing there that, God is whispering in his ear or something. But these were unknown to the church. They're unknown to the people that had this descent back to the apostles. So who are you going to believe? The church fathers said this is a matter of pedigree, of apostolic lineage. Hippolytus points to Irenaeus. He points to Polycarp, who points to John. So if there are any secrets to share, here's where John would have shared them. On the other hand, the Gnostics could point to no one. And it was that credibility gap, more than any other factor, that eventually vanquished the Gnostics. A second development in the period was the literary defense of the faith. The word meaning a legal defense, apologia, apologetics. Someone who defends the faith is an apologist. He or she issues an apology. It has nothing to do with contrition. It's not saying I'm sorry. It's an argument meant to vindicate. Think of a law room and a lawyer. And beginning in the 2nd century, there were several writers who really invented theological literature as an effort to defend Christianity against persecution. And so as a byproduct of that, they're beginning the process of defining Christian doctrine in order to clearly elucidate the fundamental beliefs and practices of a church that was being slandered. Most of their efforts did almost nothing to persuade the Romans. But the apologists contributed to a third critical aspect of this age, which was perseverance. Perseverance in the face of persecution. The greatest contributions of the apologists was not in converting pagans. It was in strengthening Christians. Those who lived in the daily prospects of having to lay down their lives for the faith were being reassured that the faith that they believe in is not some irrational novelty. It was coherent, it was consistent, it had weight, it was worth dying for. So while apologists confronted the church's external threats, she's building up the church itself. And then another group of writers began to face those internal threats, the threat of heresy. What they engaged in is known as polemics. The word is derived from the Greek word for war. In this case, it's a war of words. It's a defense of orthodoxy. It's a defense of true doctrine in the face of heresy. And it's a remarkable fact that the church faced nearly every variety of false teaching that she will ever face in the first 4 centuries of her existence. Most everything that we've seen since can be traced back to this theological trash heap of the past. It's been seen before. So the outer appearance and the names may change, but inside it's the same diseased doctrine that the church had already wrestled with. But it was heresy that forced the church to further define her own doctrine. The more subtle the heresy, the more precise she had to be. As heresies arose and challenged the church, she reacted with a growing dependence upon her Catholic identity for protection. What does that mean? Her Catholic identity. The Greek word is a union of 2 words. It means throughout the whole. So originally it was used to mean the universality of the entire church despite her being widely scattered. We're all united to the same Christ. That's the way it's used in the Apostolic Creed, the Apostles' Creed. Toward the end of the 2nd century, Catholic also became synonymous with orthodoxy. Because contrary to modern notions, true unity cannot be based on anything other than what you believe, other than doctrine. So as heretical groups began to challenge her, the true church combined the ideas of universality and orthodoxy under the one term, Catholic. We have a Catholic faith. It is a universal Orthodox faith. However, the term Catholic is also used to refer to the growing structure of church government as it began to center upon bishops, the episcopus. That will eventually lead to the abuses of Roman Catholicism. However, you have to say that without the authority of the early bishops in this time period, it's really hard to conceive of the church surviving. Because it was out of necessity that an episcopal form of government developed. We're going to look at that in later lessons. All right. So I want to set the stage for the patristic age by looking at the end of the apostolic age. So the last years of the first century are among the most hidden in the history of the church. We have virtually no first-hand accounts. What little we do know was preserved by later writers in reference. We have bits and pieces of the works of men like Papias, Hegesippus, but they're preserved for us in later histories. What we do know is by the year 95, all of the apostles had been martyred except for John. John was living out his advanced old age in Ephesus. On the throne was the Emperor Domitian. He's the youngest son of Vespasian. He's the brother of Titus. Remember, Vespasian and Titus fought the war with the Jews, conquered Judea, destroyed the temple. Now, Domitian, he's a perverse character. He abused young boys. He conducted things like gladiator fights between little people. In other words, it used to be called dwarf. Between women to the death. These are the kinds of things he thought was funny. And Domitian had also continued his father's policy of executing descendants of David. Of course, that policy was based upon destroying Jewish hopes of Messiah. We talked about that previously. I mean, really, those hopes of forcing God to send the Messiah, that was the real cause of the Jewish war. And so Rome was informed enough to understand that with the zealots trying to force God into this, why don't we just destroy the Davidic line and it can never happen? So they're going to try and prevent any future messianic uprising. And so Vespasian and then Domitian set out to extinguish the house of David. And of course that included then both Jewish and Christian descendants of David, and as we said, even reaching to the relatives of Jesus himself. So both Jews and Christians lived under considerable apprehension, yet despite Domitian demanding to be worshipped as Lord and God, these persecutions were really of a political nature. They weren't a religious persecution. As far as Christianity was concerned, Domitian viewed it as a Jewish sodalitas, and sodalitas is an illegal society. It is a prohibited club and gathering of people. Like all totalitarian states, the Roman Empire was suspicious when people congregated, especially in these private societies. More alarming to Domitian was the discovery of members in his whole own imperial household that were Christian. When his cousin Clemens Flavius was found to be a Christian, Domitian had him executed as an atheist. So to have discovered then this subversive secret society, having infiltrated the royal palaces, led to reprisals. We just don't know to what extent. Eusebius says it's no small number, but he also says it was limited to Rome itself. Now that's where Christianity stood in the eyes of the empire at the end of the first century. Really, it's almost indifferent to Christians, except when it appears in the wrong places. Now, Jewish and Christian relations were far worse. Up to the middle of the second century, Jewish hostilities were far more harmful to the church than Rome was. The hatred and the animosity that the Jews felt for the Christians really found an outlet in slander because they couldn't physically grab hold of them. Rome prevented that. After the destruction of the temple, both the Essenes and the Sadducees fade out from history. That leaves the Pharisees to mold the future of Judaism. In Palestine, the Jews find a new leader in Gamaliel II. This is the grandson of Paul's teacher. And for all that we know, He may have played at Paul's feet while he was being taught. But Gamaliel established a new theological center for Judaism at Jamnia, which is modern-day Joppa, which is Jaffa. And it was there in the year 90 that the collection of books that we know as the Old Testament was finally codified as Jewish scripture, and the canon was officially closed. It had never been closed before that. And it was specifically done because of the circulation of New Testament writings. No, you can't read that one. It's these, is the canon. And at the same time, curses against the Christians were being added to the Shema. Let me know if that's the right pronunciation even. I don't know. But it's a piece of liturgy recited in the synagogues. It's always been there. The Lord our God is one, right? Now it included prayers for the destruction of the Christian heretics. During the same decade, a campaign of slander and propaganda was launched out of the Eastern diaspora in Babylon. So at almost every turn, Christians are confronted with these horrid accusations. And it was really the Jewish agitation that helped spur the growing animosity that Rome felt towards Christianity. And that was the intent. Jewish leaders are trying to get the Romans on their side against the church because only the Romans had the power to destroy her. Now, let me just say, because it's in the air today, the Jews have suffered more at the hands of Christians than the other way around. So you need to remember that. But despite the War of 70 AD, Judaism still enjoyed a legal status that Christianity could not equal. Judaism being this legal religion, you could still gain proselytes. You could still attract people to the monotheism and the ethical standards that are there in Judaism. And about the same time, Josephus wrote his works in defense of Judaism, which he called a reasonable man's religion. Well, no Christian could match the fame that was attached to this man after its release. But in this context between Judaism and Christianity, none of the advantages of the Jews could overcome this one barrier. Part of the Jewish ceremonial law, the Gentile revulsion of circumcision. And on top of that, you had legalistic diets and new moons, all of this stuff. They could not, most of them refused to participate. And so more than one Gentile writer at the time referred to the fussiness of the Jews. And so all of these aspects of this bitter contest between Christian and Jew was pushing the church farther and farther and farther away from her original roots in the land of Canaan. And what was happening in this last decade of the first century was an increased pace of polarization between Christian, Jew, and pagan. They're all splitting. And that brings us to the end of the Apostolic Age. And in AD 96, one of the servants of Clemens Flavius, remember this is the executed cousin of Domitian, found to be a Christian, put to death as an atheist. Well, this servant of Clemens Flavius conspired with the emperor's mistress to murder him in revenge. He was stabbed in the royal chambers. He bled to death. Now, to give you a sense of what they thought about Domitian, upon the death of any emperor, the Senate would vote on whether to deify the memory or vilify the memory. Domitian was declared a tyrant. They said his death is a blessing. Thank the gods. In any case, now you have to elect a new one. Of course, an emperor was always given the title of Augustus, and his heir apparent was given the title of Caesar. An elderly senator named Nerva was given the title of Augustus. He took the throne. He appointed as Caesar a general named Marcus Trajanus. We know him as Trajan. These two men are the first of what are known as the 5 good emperors. And that's because the focus of their rule was not on their own personal perversities, but on the welfare of the nation. However, some of these men believed that what was in the national interest was to eliminate Christians. So the 5 good emperors were not always good for the church. And that became typical of her persecutions. With the exception of Nero, the church tended to suffer more under good rulers than bad ones, because the bad ones are just occupied with their own depravities. They didn't really care about the church. So whenever you had a good ruler who was there to do his best for the country, that's when the church came under her most severe persecution. As for Nerva, he was in office for only a couple of years. His position on Christianity reflected this continued confusion over what the church was. He refused to officially outlaw Christianity, yet he also refused to legalize it. In AD 98, Nerva died. Trajan became Augustus. Not long after, we have John, the last living apostle, passing on and dying. So with his passing, now the church enters this new age, the patristic age. Now, from a national standpoint, Trajan was one of the best emperors in Roman history. The Roman population actually remembered him as the father of his country. And for generations after his death, it was a practice to wish upon any new emperor. They would say, "May you have the felicity of Augustus and the virtue of Trajan." And Trajan was. He was an able statesman. He was also a soldier. But his rule revolved around obedience and allegiance, and this was something that he suspected the church didn't possess. To him, obedience and allegiance. But still, the church is poorly understood. Remember, we said that any unauthorized society was always viewed with suspicion. I'll just give you an example. We have records of an application made to the emperor by some firemen in Nicomedia. They want to form their own club of firemen. And the Romans turned it down. And if you can't trust your firemen, who are you going to trust? So from Trajan's point of view, he didn't need to know the particulars about Christianity. That really didn't matter to him. It was enough that they weren't sanctioned by the government to come together and congregate. And that in itself made Rome question their loyalty and their obedience. So in a political environment where assassinations and sedition are commonplace, there's an incentive to be suspicious of everybody. And so in keeping with that suspicion, Trajan revived all of the old laws against secret societies. They'd been unenforced for years, but now they had focus. Now secret societies were not just unsanctioned, they were being declared illegal and prohibited. It was treason. It was punishable by death. And he wasn't directing this specifically at the church. In fact, as we will see, the empire has lost track of Christianity. But the effects of the policy allowed for local governors to treat the Christians as criminals. Right? Now, the last thing we're going to look at this morning is an example of an official like that who would come to view the church in this fashion. What is this? What's Christianity about? Looks like something I should be suspicious of. And so this man's name was Pliny the Younger. This is how he dealt with the Christian problem. So Pliny was a lawyer. He was a personal friend of Trajan. Trajan used him for crisis management. And the province of Bithynia, up there at the top of modern-day Turkey, was experiencing the kind of crisis that called for Pliny's talents. There had been years of mismanagement in Bithynia. The area was devastated economically. That economy had collapsed. They're in desperate financial situation. So in the year 109, Trajan sends Pliny to investigate what's going on and correct anything you find. He gave him the powers, the office of a temporary governor. Go do it. Well, once Pliny arrives in Bithynia, like any good administrator, he goes throughout the country. He's reestablishing what he's ordering where he needs it, and he's trying to put the economy back in place on a good footing. But then he reaches an area in the far eastern end of the district, and it was unlike anything he'd seen before. The pagan temples sat unused. They're vacant. They're in decay. Some of them are falling down. Sacrifice hadn't been observed in them for years. Idol makers and sacrifice dealers, almost impossible to find. Most of them have gone on to other vocations. I can't make a living making idols anymore. And this was a mystery. Pliny wanted to know the cause. So when he asked about the situation, he was told that a sect known as the Christians were to blame. Now that's very interesting that Pliny is unfamiliar with Christians. He's a Roman lawyer. You would think he'd know something about the Christians. But what this suggests is that the persecutions under Nero and Domitian had so decimated the Roman church, there were only remnants, almost completely hidden. In any case, Pliny is so intrigued, he orders several of the Christians to be brought in for questioning. And whatever he asked them, whatever he demanded of them, he was not satisfied, and he grew angry at the refusals. He finally orders them to be executed. And then he writes to Trajan, I don't know what they're guilty of, but their obstinacy alone is worthy of punishment. So whatever he asked them, Pliny didn't get the answers that he thought were satisfactory to him. And then the situation grew a little more complicated. Someone anonymously provided a list of names of people supposed to be Christians. Several of these were tortured for information. And we know that that included a number of young women who were placed on the rack. I'm sure you know what the rack is. You tie your hands, your feet, they stretch it till your sockets dislocate. In the end, most of the people that he interviewed didn't give up their faith, and they wouldn't give Pliny any other further information, such as names. A small number did recant. Others claimed, at one time I looked into it, but I never became a Christian. So what we're seeing is a generally Christianized area, a mix of people who truly believe and others who are on the fringe. But by this time, Pliny was fairly satisfied that this religion was nothing, he said, but a depraved superstition. He was perplexed at its popularity. But the situation created a judicial problem for Pliny. He didn't know how to handle it. Should he punish them? Maybe on something that they were years and years ago, or should the Christians be punished at all? I mean, what exactly are they guilty of? And so he wrote back to Trajan for instruction. He reported that this religion was constantly spreading, and it so captivated the people that the temples are forsaken. Sacrificial animals are left unsold at market. He told Trajan that he had devised a test for those who said they weren't Christians. He discovered that no true Christian would curse the name of Christ. And he applied this test on weak individuals who had initially denied being in the church. Said, no, I'm not a Christian. Okay, curse Christ. But now he sought Trajan's direction. He's still unsure of what Christianity's legal status is. And so he responds, Trajan does, he says, you have adopted the proper course in your examination of the cases that were accused to you of being Christians, for indeed nothing can be laid down as a general ruling. He says they're not to be sought out, but if they're accused and convicted, they must be punished, but on this condition, that whoso denies himself to be a Christian and makes the fact plain by his action, that is, by worshiping our gods, you obtain pardon on his repentance, however suspicious his past conduct may be. So this is the first time that an emperor has made Christianity forbidden by name. Okay? But he still says, don't go searching for them, but if you find them, punish. Okay? They're a secret society. All right, we are out of time. As I said, we were going to stop right at 10:30.